A silver shape darted alongside the bomber over the North Atlantic, engines dead, instruments frozen. A cold pressure gripped the cabin, and the crew felt eyes on them that were not human. Object X had arrived, and the war above was only half the battle. The airfield lay on a flat stretch of coastal plain in the southern part of the United States. In the spring of 1943, the runways had been extended under the pretext of handling heavier bombers, but beneath the concrete a different construction had taken place. Crews working at night had dug long corridors of reinforced concrete, each tunnel wide enough for 2 trucks to pass side by side. From above, nothing betrayed their presence. Only a series of innocuous maintenance sheds painted in dull olive marked the access points. Inside the earth, the atmosphere was dense and without daylight. The walls sweated condensation, a thin film that smelled faintly of limestone and machine oil. Air moved through hidden ducts, filtered and chilled, carrying a metallic tang. Each passageway led to sealed doors that opened into chambers lit by rows of low-wattage bulbs protected by wire cages. The light was weak and yellow, making every object appear already archived, as though the rooms themselves were pieces of evidence. The official paperwork called the place a radar evaluation annex. In reality, the tunnels had been designed as a hermetic environment for the interception and study of unknown signals reported over the Atlantic Ocean. Reports from bomber crews had described strange lights following their formations at altitudes where no friendly aircraft were scheduled to fly. The description spoke of spheres that glowed pale white or orange, sometimes darting ahead of the planes, sometimes pacing them silently. Each incident was logged, cross-referenced, and filed under a classification that no one outside the project could decipher. Technicians stationed in the underground facility were not permitted to send or receive private correspondence. Every message passed through sensors and was rewritten as a bland summary before leaving the base. The isolation was deliberate. Without newspapers, without radio broadcasts except the monitored channels piped in by the Office of Naval Intelligence, the personnel inhabited a closed system. Their clocks ran on military time, but without the rhythm of sunrise or sunset. Days became numbered shifts rather than dates. In the deeper chambers stood banks of listening equipment built into heavy steel racks. Oscilloscopes flickered with green traces that crawled across their screens. Tape reels turned slowly, capturing bursts of static from the transatlantic ether. On one table lay a series of maps covered in acetate overlays, showing the flight paths of bomber groups and the positions where anomalous contacts had been reported. Small red grease pencil dots marked the sightings. Blue circles indicated radio interference. Faint pencil lines linked them into constellations of mystery. The staff moved like archivists rather than soldiers. They wore lab coats over khaki uniforms, the fabric stiff from industrial laundering. Each had an identification badge with a number instead of a name. Conversations were minimal. Orders arrived in sealed envelopes from an upstairs office whose windows were painted black. Even their coffee was rationed and delivered in sealed tins stamped with inspection codes. The effect was to render every action procedural, as if each gesture had already been recorded and filed. Generators drummed in a separate cavern carved from the bedrock. The sound was steady but low, like a heartbeat. Above it, faint and intermittent, came other noises, the crackle of distant lightning captured by antennas, the occasional metallic thump of shifting pipes, and sometimes a high whine that none of the engineers could trace. In logbooks, these noises were entered under the heading Ambient Anomalies, with times noted to the second in spidery handwriting. On the far end of the complex lay a chamber without any instruments, just a single table, a chair, and a wall of steel cabinets. This was the archive room. Here, thick folders accumulated, each stamped with multiple security classifications. The earliest documents described erratic blips on radar screens off Newfoundland, but as the months progressed, the language grew more clinical, speaking of persistent luminous phenomena and unknown flight characteristics. Photographs clipped to the pages showed nothing but streaks and dots, yet the notations beneath them were increasingly dense with technical jargon. The tunnels had no windows, but a few shafts led upward to hidden grates where filtered air rose into the pine woods beyond the perimeter fence. Personnel on brief surface details described the contrast as jarring. After hours underground, sunlight seemed hostile, the sky too open. Returning below felt like entering the true world, while the surface became a facade. Over time, this inversion deepened. Men who had arrived as confident specialists began to lose weight, their skin taking on the pallor of the tunnel light. Sleep patterns broke down. Dreams became vivid and recurring, often featuring the same silent spheres described in the bomber reports. Everything in the facility was designed to look routine, but every detail signaled a hidden urgency. Supplies arrived in unmarked crates at night. Contractors who poured the concrete had been rotated out and sworn to secrecy. Even the numbering of the corridors was irregular, a labyrinth intended to prevent any outsider from mapping it completely. Somewhere beyond the main galleries, engineers had walled off a deeper shaft, claiming unstable ground. The personnel who passed near it swore they felt a faint vibration under their boots, a pulse separate from the generators. It was never entered in the logs. As the war raged overseas, the tunnels under the airfield became a microcosm of secrecy. While headlines spoke of campaigns and victories, below ground another campaign unfolded, one measured in signal strengths, unexplained radar returns, and the nervous tension of men who sensed they were observing not just an enemy, but something entirely unanticipated. The air smelled of paper, solar, and anticipation. Every sound echoed, every movement left a trace. And above them, hidden by coastal fog, the sky remained crowded with reports that refused to resolve into ordinary explanations. During the late winter and spring of 1943, while the European and Pacific theaters consumed the attention of newspapers, a quieter pattern of reports began to accumulate in the sealed offices under the airfield. Bomber groups flying from bases in Britain and from carriers in the North Atlantic submitted routine mission summaries, but scattered among them were entries marked with a discrete stamp indicating special handling. These entries described objects that had no flight plan and no conventional explanation. Crew members recorded seeing silver-colored spheres and elongated shapes that glowed with a faint bluish or greenish light. The descriptions were consistent across multiple squadrons separated by hundreds of miles and by days of flying. The spheres sometimes paced the bombers at fixed distances, sometimes darted ahead, and at other times appeared to materialize abruptly out of cloud cover. Some crews noted that the objects emitted no contrails and produced no detectable engine noise. Others reported that their onboard instruments fluctuated or briefly failed when the phenomena were near. Each account arrived on thin onion skin paper, typed in block letters, signed by commanding officers, and transmitted under sealed courier to the United States Airfield's underground archive. Clerks logged the time and place of every sighting, using long columns of data filled with coordinates, altitudes, and atmospheric conditions. The information was then transferred onto large plotting boards. These boards were covered with transparent overlays where colored grease pencil marks accumulated like constellations. Red circles denoted visual sightings, blue triangles indicated radio disturbances, and faint pencil lines linked successive reports into tentative trajectories. In a separate chamber, Analysts compiled frequency graphs from intercepted transmissions. Tape reels captured bursts of static and occasional sharp spikes at bands normally reserved for military communications. When correlated with the flight logs, these spikes aligned with the moments when crews had reported luminous objects. The resulting charts showed a pattern that was neither random nor entirely regular, a kind of pulse repeating at irregular intervals, like a heartbeat that occasionally skipped. Thermal observers contributed their own data. Using crude infrared film and newly developed detection devices, they attempted to register heat signatures of the anomalies. Most of the exposures came back blank or fogged, but a few frames displayed smudges of brightness not associated with any known aircraft. The smudges were cooler than expected for engines, yet warmer than the surrounding sky, a contradiction that filled the margins of reports with handwritten question marks. Electromagnetic anomalies were documented with equal care. Antenna arrays stationed along the eastern seaboard recorded surges and nulls coinciding with the times of sightings. Oscilloscopes in the underground lab traced jagged patterns that did not match atmospheric lightning or ordinary interference. Each printout was numbered and filed, then cross-indexed with the flight charts. A growing library of folders occupied the steel cabinets, their edges frayed from constant reference. The language of the reports remained outwardly dry. Sentences began with phrases like "object observed" or "phenomenon persisted." Yet as the months passed, subtle changes crept into the tone. Analysts added more qualifiers, more underlining, more conditional phrases that revealed unease. Some entries contained entire paragraphs of technical speculation about unknown propulsion or possible psychological effects on aircrews. In the margin of one summary, a clerk had penciled the words "pattern expanding," then erased them so lightly that the imprint remained. By early summer, the archive held dozens of such accounts. Maps of the North Atlantic bristled with colored pins marking locations from Newfoundland to the Bay of Biscay. Overlays of successive weeks showed the pins forming arcs that paralleled bomber routes but also extended far beyond them into empty ocean. A separate set of charts tracked the electromagnetic disturbances inland, as though whatever generated them reached across thousands of miles. Inside the sealed rooms, the act of compiling became a ritual. Papers arrived, were stamped, were copied onto larger sheets, were annotated, and finally were locked away. Each step was witnessed by at least 2 people who signed their initials in logbooks. The process gave the appearance of control, but behind the neat handwriting and precise times, the sense of something uncontrolled grew stronger. Personnel who had once treated the sightings as curiosities began to speak of them only in code phrases and looked over their shoulders when carrying folders through the corridors. The reports included meteorological data, wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, cloud formations. Analysts tried to correlate the phenomena with auroras, with ball lightning, with reflections from other aircraft. Each hypothesis generated a new table of numbers, and each table failed to erase the anomalies. Even after adjusting for atmospheric optics, radar ghosts, and instrument errors, clusters of unexplained events persisted. The file headings lengthened, the stamps grew bolder, but the explanations thinned. In the infrared darkroom, the chemical smell of developer mixed with the low hum of ventilation fans. Technicians hunched over negatives with magnifying lenses, tracing faint outlines on translucent film. Some negatives contained tiny specks, arranged like beads on a string. Others showed a single elongated smear against a star field. The technicians labeled them with times and coordinates, but left the description lines blank. They no longer attempted to name what they saw. By the end of that spring, the combined weight of data, maps, graphs, photographs, and typed testimonies filled entire shelves. The cabinets were heavy enough to bow the floor gratings. Each drawer contained evidence that individually seemed ambiguous, but together hinted at a sustained and coordinated presence following Allied aircraft. Above ground, the war continued in headlines and dispatches, but below ground, another narrative took shape in rows of red dots, blue triangles, and handwritten notes that stopped short of conclusions. Everything about the archive radiated secrecy. The lighting remained low to protect photographs, the temperature constant to preserve tapes. Even the air felt filtered of ordinary noise. In this muted environment, the accumulation of reports became more than record-keeping. It was an unfolding pattern, a slow recognition of something that moved through the skies with its own intent. The clerks and analysts did not speak of it aloud, but their careful, relentless annotations formed an unspoken consensus. The incidents of 1943 were not isolated accidents of perception. They were the beginning of a larger and stranger chapter yet to be named. In the first week of June of 1943, the North Atlantic was a gray expanse of wind-whipped water under low clouds. Convoys moved like slow chains across the sea, while escort aircraft traced protective arcs above them. On one such patrol, an American escort plane, a twin-engine craft hardened by months of routine, entered a sector where radio interference had been reported repeatedly. The crew expected static and poor visibility. Instead, they found a silence so complete it pressed against their ears like deep water. Through the cockpit glass, the horizon dissolved into layers of mist. Instruments recorded a normal altitude, normal speed, and normal heading. Yet on the observer's chart, a pencil circle marked the exact coordinates where multiple sightings had been plotted during previous weeks. The navigator made notes of wind direction and barometric pressure, unaware that his neat handwriting would later become part of a classified archive. Outside the plane, the air carried an odd shimmer, like heat haze, though the temperature registered near freezing. At first, the object appeared as a brighter patch in the cloud bank. It resolved slowly, not like an aircraft emerging, but as though it condensed from the atmosphere itself. The crew expected to see wings, tail surfaces, or rotor blades. None were present. Instead, a single elongated form, smooth and metallic, glided against the prevailing wind. Its surface reflected no sunlight but glowed with a muted internal sheen, a pale silver white that seemed to absorb surrounding colors. Observers estimated its length as greater than the plane's wingspan, though the absence of reference points made measurements uncertain. According to procedure, the escort signaled its position and attempted to photograph the phenomenon. The onboard camera used glass plates preloaded in the ground laboratory. When developed later, those plates would show blurred silhouettes, streaked as if by movement faster than the shutter could record. In the moment of exposure, the crew felt a brief tremor through the fuselage, like distant thunder not yet heard. Dials on the instrument panel flicked wildly and then froze. Compass needles drifted to arbitrary headings. The engines continued to turn, but the familiar vibration of their pistons dulled, as though transmitted through a thick medium. Seconds stretched unnaturally. Witnesses later wrote that the space inside the aircraft seemed compressed, as if the walls had drawn closer without moving. Breath misted more heavily despite the cabin heaters. The radio operator reported nothing, not because he was silent, but because his microphone carried only a flat line on the receiver tape. Sound itself had thinned. Even the engine's roar faded to a muted pulse, less a noise than a sensation in the bones. Outside the window, the object maintained a parallel course. No propulsion jets, propellers, or control surfaces were visible. Its motion was steady, unhurried, indifferent to turbulence. At intervals, its surface showed faint ripples of light running lengthwise, patterns that bore no relation to navigation lamps. When the escort banked slightly, the object countered, keeping distance constant. For an instant, it tilted, revealing a cross-section like a flattened ellipse. The color shifted toward a dim bluish glow, as if something beneath its skin stirred. Inside the cabin, frost began to form along metal edges. The navigator's pencil snapped under his grip without his noticing. Later, his logbook would show a line of script slanting upward across the page before stopping abruptly. Another crewman dropped his stopwatch. The second hand had ceased moving, though the mechanism ticked faintly. Small, disconnected sensory impressions accumulated: a metallic taste in the mouth, a pressure behind the eyes, a sudden memory of a different place with no origin. None of these were spoken aloud at the time. They appeared only in post-mission debriefings. Then, without transition, the object accelerated. Not forward or backward, but outward, as if it receded into another layer of distance. One moment, it occupied the sky beside the aircraft. The next, it was a dim point fading into mist. With its disappearance, sound rushed back. The engines roared, loose items rattled, and needles on the gauges snapped to positions consistent with normal flight. The navigator's watch resumed its tick, though several minutes had elapsed unrecorded. The crew exchanged glances, but wrote nothing yet. Back at the base, the glass plates were removed under guard and sent directly to the underground laboratory. Technicians in white coats developed them in chemical baths cooled to precise temperatures. The resulting images were ambiguous: smears of light against a clouded background, an elongated shadow where no aircraft should be. Measuring grids placed over the negatives revealed distortions inconsistent with camera shake or film defects. Analysts noted faint concentric bands radiating from the shape, as though the emulsion itself had been impressed by a field rather than light. The official report compiled afterward bore the heading Object X in black stencil letters. It described coordinates, altitude, weather, instrument readings, and physiological reactions of the crew. The language remained clinical: loss of acoustic perception, transient magnetic deviation, visual observation of elongated fusiform structure, but the details marked a threshold. For the first time, a sighting included a tangible alteration of environment and measurable data on multiple instruments. The report was classified above top secret and locked in a cabinet whose key bore no label. In the weeks that followed, the escort crew underwent medical evaluations. Doctors measured reflexes, pupil dilation, and blood chemistry. Nothing abnormal was found except elevated stress hormones and unusual sleep patterns. Dreams were recorded in notebooks provided by the intelligence office. Recurring images of corridors narrowing, of cold metallic light, of a presence without form. These notes joined the technical data in a growing file that already strained the hinges of its folder. Above, the Atlantic convoys continued their journeys unaware. The sky returned to gray normality. Yet in the sealed rooms beneath the airfield, the incident of early June of 1943 became a reference point. A column heading in new tables, a baseline for phenomena not yet named. The contact had been brief, wordless, and unacknowledged, but its signature lay across photographs, instruments, and human memory like a watermark. Within the logic of the archive, it stood as the first confirmed engagement with something beyond conventional aviation, a moment when the war's familiar geography intersected with an unknown presence that moved against the wind and against understanding itself. In late June of 1943, under the cover of night and without any official announcement, a sealed wooden crate arrived at the coastal airfield. It bore no markings other than a single serial code painted in dull black. 2 military policemen signed a chain of custody form and wheeled it into a hangar that had been cleared and locked. The building, once used for engine overhauls, now contained a row of long tables covered with clean paper, racks of glassware, and a bank of heavy instruments powered by humming transformers. Only a handful of officers and civilian scientists were admitted. Their names were entered in a ledger kept by a clerk who did not look up from his pen. Inside the crate lay fragments of a material retrieved from the zone of contact in the North Atlantic. The recovery team had used tongs and lead-lined containers, following instructions transmitted from the headquarters hours after the incident. No one described exactly how the fragments had been collected. The written report mentioned only specimens removed from water surface near incident coordinates. Each piece was irregular, like broken sections of a shell, yet the edges showed no jaggedness. Instead, they were smooth as if molded and then separated without force. Under the dim electric lights of the hangar, they displayed a muted luster, neither metallic nor mineral, a tone that shifted subtly between silver, gray, and pale green. The first stage of analysis involved basic physical tests. The scientists weighed each fragment on precision scales, measured dimensions with calipers, and noted temperature, density, and reflectivity. Every reading went into a notebook ruled with squares. In some cases, the instruments registered values outside expected ranges, a density greater than any known alloy combined with a surface hardness that dulled steel probes. Attempts to scratch the material left no mark. When immersed briefly in diluted acids, it produced no reaction, not even a trace of gas or discoloration. When subjected to heat from a blowtorch, it remained cool to the touch. The second stage consisted of spectrographic examination. A prism spectrograph captured emission lines from thin shavings, ablated by a micro drill. The resulting spectra showed familiar bands of nickel and titanium, but interspersed with unclassified lines at wavelengths not catalogued in any reference book. Analysts wrote them down as provisional symbols. A separate team conducted radiometric measurements using Geiger counters and ion chambers. The fragments emitted faint pulses in the radio frequency range, not continuous but patterned. These pulses repeated at irregular intervals like a heartbeat without rhythm. Recorders traced them on paper strips that unrolled slowly from a drum. The amplitude remained low but constant through several days of monitoring. During these sessions, the atmosphere inside the hangar shifted. The air smelled of solvent and ozone from high-voltage equipment. Fluorescent tubes flickered slightly whenever the fragments were moved. Some observers complained of headaches, blurred vision, or a metallic taste on the tongue. One technician left early after losing track of several minutes. He had been holding a stopwatch to time an exposure, but found its second hand frozen, though the mechanism ticked faintly. These incidents were noted in the margins of the logbooks, but not discussed aloud. The written language remained clinical. Subject experienced transient disorientation, brief cessation of time awareness, instrumental irregularity. Each night, the specimens were sealed in a steel cabinet lined with lead and grounded to a copper rod driven deep into the concrete floor. Guards posted outside rotated every 2 hours. Even so, some reported disturbed sleep after their shifts, dreams of corridors narrowing or of faint sounds without source. The medical officer recorded elevated stress indicators but found no physical pathology. He recommended shorter exposure times, but the schedule of tests continued. A third stage of investigation involved magnetic resonance and electrical induction experiments. Coils wound from fine copper wire surrounded the fragments, and currents of measured amperage were passed through them. Oscilloscopes displayed patterns resembling modulated signals, rising and falling in complexity. Analysts traced them onto transparent overlays and compared them across days. The patterns changed slightly each session, as though responding to unknown conditions. No one proposed an interpretation. The official instruction remained: collect data only, refrain from speculation. By early July of 1943, the laboratory compiled hundreds of pages of charts, graphs, and typed summaries. A master index cross-referenced sample numbers, test types, and anomalies, yet no unifying explanation emerged. The fragments resisted classification not only by composition but by behavior. They appeared inert, yet emitted signals. They showed no magnetic field, yet affected compasses. They felt cool, yet induced warmth on photographic plates. Each contradiction was entered in precise, impersonal language. The scientists themselves grew quieter, their conversations reduced to procedural phrases. The presence of the artifacts exerted a gravity of its own, drawing attention yet discouraging interpretation. Security procedures increased. Windows of the hangar were painted over. Deliveries arrived at night. All waste products from experiments, even disposable gloves and paper towels, were sealed in drums for off-site incineration. A single telephone connected the hangar to the command office. It rang rarely and only for coded messages. Visitors signed non-disclosure agreements whose text filled multiple pages. The fragments became less like samples and more like custodial responsibilities, objects whose meaning might extend beyond the war, yet remained hidden within it. In mid-July, a special photographic series was undertaken using high-speed film and long exposures. The goal was to capture the faint radio pulses as visual phenomena. Plates developed afterward showed diffuse halos surrounding the fragments, concentric but asymmetric like ripples frozen in glass. Measurement of the spacing revealed ratios not matching any known interference pattern. The results were filed under a separate code number and stored in a locked drawer accessible only to the lead scientist and a military intelligence officer. When the team reviewed the negatives under a magnifying lens, several felt a momentary vertigo as though the images conveyed depth beyond their surface. Throughout these procedures, the official stance remained one of observation without conclusion. Each anomaly was a data point, not a revelation. The scientists wrote their reports in the same tone used for weather logs or equipment maintenance: neutral, detached, exhaustive. Yet behind the precision grew an unspoken awareness that the fragments did not belong to any recognized category of matter or manufacture. They were not debris from an enemy aircraft, not shards of meteorite, not industrial waste carried by currents. Their origin lay outside the catalog of wartime intelligence, and that absence formed a negative space in every document produced. By the end of July of 1943, the cabinet holding the fragments was moved to an underground vault beneath the airfield. The hangar was disinfected, repainted, and returned to ordinary maintenance use. Officially, the study continued in a restricted facility. Unofficially, it entered a deeper phase of secrecy where even the scientists' names disappeared from cover sheets. Only specimen codes and test results remained. The disturbances of memory and sleep persisted among those who had handled the material, but these too were absorbed into the protocol as minor side effects, not subjects for inquiry. Thus, the investigation of artifacts progressed not toward explanation, but toward accumulation of facts without context. Each spectrum, each pulse, each photograph added another layer to a file already too heavy for one person to lift. In the logic of the archive, the fragments became a fixed point, an origin of data that refused to resolve into knowledge. They stood as silent evidence of contact whose implications the language of reports could not capture, contained within steel and paper, yet extending into the minds of those who measured them. A quiet influence spreading outward from a moment in the North Atlantic when something had moved against the wind and left pieces of itself behind. From the early months of 1944 through the winter of 1947, the investigation continued under a new classification. The sealed folders were stamped with a code phrase known only to a few officers. The original hangar had been emptied. and the operation moved into a network of underground rooms built beneath the runways. The transition was described in paperwork as a routine consolidation of research facilities, but in practice it marked the beginning of a phase where secrecy became a discipline rather than a procedure. Scientists no longer signed their full names on reports. Instead, each used a three-letter identifier typed in black ink. Over time, the personnel began to notice changes in their own perception. At first, it was minor and intermittent, like the sensation of pressure in the ears after a rapid change of altitude. Technicians reported a soft ringing sound that persisted even when instruments were turned off. Guards described momentary losses of smell, particularly the scent of fuel or oil in the corridors. These effects were dismissed as fatigue, but as months passed, they deepened. By late 1945, some members of the core team exhibited a measurable reduction in auditory response. Medical examinations recorded normal tympanic membranes and neural conduction, yet thresholds for tone detection had shifted. The phenomenon spread unevenly. One analyst lost the ability to discern high frequencies while another failed to register low ones. A similar erosion affected temporal awareness. Clocks installed in the vault began to drift. The discrepancies were small at first, a few seconds per day, but accumulated. Mechanical watches worn by staff gained or lost minutes without pattern. Chronographs used to time experiments produced inconsistent readings. Photographs developed from long exposures showed black voids at their centers, as though light itself had been absorbed. The chemists rechecked their reagents and darkroom procedures but found no contamination. Each anomaly was recorded in impersonal language: exposure defect, temporal deviation, auditory impairment. Yet the accumulation of such entries formed a pattern visible to anyone who turned enough pages. By 1946, the Internal Security Office began compiling its own parallel file titled Extension of Influence of Object X. It was not distributed to the scientific staff. The file contained memoranda describing equipment malfunctions, unexplained power fluctuations, and incidents where personnel left restricted areas but later could not recall the route they had taken. One guard reported walking a corridor of standard length but reaching the far door only after what felt like several minutes of extra distance. His statement was attached to the file with no comment. The official position remained that no causal link had been established between the artifacts and the effects. The physical environment of the underground rooms also began to shift in subtle ways. Paint peeled faster than expected despite controlled humidity. Metal shelves acquired a faint iridescence not explained by corrosion. Photographic plates stored far from the test chamber developed pale silhouettes resembling interference patterns. Instruments shipped directly from manufacturers sometimes arrived with components already misaligned as if affected during transit. Every item that entered the vault was logged, but the log itself became unstable, pages out of order, ink fading in irregular bands, dates written by clerks but later appearing smudged. The people changed along with the setting. Sleep disturbances became common. Some staff dreamed of corridors stretching beyond sight or of faint shapes moving just beyond the edge of vision. Others reported a narrowing of emotional range, a flattening of effect, as if long hours near the specimens drained their ability to feel. A psychologist from the Army Air Forces conducted brief interviews but concluded that stress and secrecy were sufficient explanations. His report used the phrase operational monotony, but privately he noted an unusual uniformity in speech cadence among interviewees, as though their internal clocks had begun to synchronize to an unseen pulse. During these years, official agencies continued to deny any acknowledgement of extraterrestrial presence. The project was described to higher headquarters as foreign material analysis with no further specification. Funding came through channels marked for radar development or counterintelligence. Publicly, the war ended, troops returned home, and new technologies entered civilian life. But in the underground rooms, the work went on with no outward sign of change. The artifacts themselves were now sealed in a triple-layered containment system. Inner lead boxes placed within steel drums, anchored to the concrete floor and connected to grounding rods. Yet, even with these measures, the signals persisted, faint pulses picked up by coil antennas and charted by pen recorders on long rolls of paper. By mid-1947, the cumulative toll on personnel could no longer be ignored. A quarter of the original team had been reassigned for health reasons. Replacement staff arrived but soon developed similar symptoms. The auditory losses progressed to near complete absence of certain frequencies. Sense of smell diminished, particularly for organic compounds. Temporal disorientation reached a point where scheduled shifts became unreliable. Some workers would appear early without realizing it or linger after hours believing only minutes had passed. Equipment designed to measure electromagnetic fields showed sudden null readings as though space itself had been momentarily evacuated. In the archives, the documents multiplied. Each incident generated at least 3 copies, one for the scientific file, one for security, and one for a compartmentalized intelligence cell. The language remained dry, even as it described events that resisted the boundaries of the laboratory. Anomalous blackening of film, failure of mechanical clocks, transient spatial distortion. Each phrase stood alone on a line, stripped of speculation. Over time, these phrases formed a litany, a quiet record of a growing domain of influence. The staff still used the code name Object X, but among themselves, in the few moments between tasks, they sometimes referred to the zone, not as a place, but as a condition spreading outward from the sealed containers. Throughout this period, the chain of command held firm. No public statements, no external reviews, no acknowledgement of anything beyond material analysis. Requests for theoretical interpretation were returned with redacted margins. Funding continued, but the project existed in a space between official reality and private knowledge. It had become not just a study of fragments, but a prolonged experiment on the limits of perception, conducted unwittingly on the people who served within it. In this way, the consequences of the first contact extended beyond the artifacts, beyond the hangar and the vault, into the bodies and minds of those who kept watch over them, an invisible front of a war that had officially ended, but in another sense, had only begun. By the autumn of 1949, the underground laboratories beneath the airfield had become increasingly vacant. Personnel turnover had accelerated in the previous years, with some scientists transferring to unrelated military projects, others resigning quietly, and a small but significant number vanishing without explanation. Records note the departure dates and official reassignment destinations, but subsequent follow-ups sometimes revealed that the individuals were found in psychiatric wards, suffering from chronic disorientation, memory lapses, and vivid hallucinations. Their mental states cataloged as operational fatigue or stress-induced psychosis. These classifications, however, concealed the deeper effects noted in internal logs. Prolonged exposure to the artifacts had altered neurological functions in ways that were observable, yet could not be quantified within the conventional frameworks of the time. The tunnels themselves, concrete-lined and reinforced with steel beams, had begun to show subtle signs of decay. Moisture seeped through cracks in the walls where ventilation ducts once circulated air, leaving faint mineral deposits along the floor. Electrical conduits, largely abandoned after instruments were removed, occasionally produced flickers of light and static discharges, recorded in maintenance logs as unexplained voltage anomalies. These anomalies coincided with days when security reports noted a perceived presence by lone personnel, though no tangible evidence was documented. Surveillance cameras had been removed or disabled, yet staff occasionally mentioned shadowed figures at the edge of vision or the sensation of movement in empty corridors. In the archives, stacks of reports continued to accumulate. Each folder detailed experiments, observations, and anomalies, all labeled with strictly numerical codes and dates written in full. Even the smallest incident, such as the temporary failure of a chronograph or the fleeting distortion of a photographic plate, was recorded with clinical detachment. Researchers' personal notations occasionally hinted at anxiety or fear, but these were crossed out or redacted before submission. The official narrative remained that the facility's work pertained solely to material analysis and electromagnetic testing. Any mention of extraterrestrial contact, the Object X, or the strange phenomena observed in 1943 was restricted to classified memos accessible only to top-level personnel. By mid-1950, the bulk of equipment had been dismantled and shipped to other installations under multiple layers of security. Specialized machines, spectrographs, and sensitive electromagnetic detectors were labeled as surplus or reassigned to radar research programs. The artifacts themselves were placed in reinforced containment units and transported under armed guard to undisclosed locations. Only a handful of staff remained on site to oversee the transition, and their reports noted a growing emptiness in the corridors. The airfield above continued operations as a standard military facility, but the subterranean network had largely ceased functioning. Concrete tunnels echoed with the sound of dripping water and occasional gusts of wind seeping from ventilation shafts. Human absence was mirrored by a subtle degradation in environmental control. Temperature regulators no longer maintained strict parameters, resulting in gradual fluctuations of a few degrees each day. Humidity rose in some areas, corroding metal surfaces that had been carefully preserved for research purposes. Instruments left powered intermittently produced erratic readings, as though the residual influence of the artifacts persisted despite their removal. Logs noted these occurrences with the same detached phrasing used throughout the project: instrumental deviation, ambient anomaly, structural fluctuation. Even as personnel dwindled, the facility retained a lingering sense of presence, recorded by those few remaining and terse statements about the atmospheric quality and indefinable tension. Medical reports from the last remaining staff documented persistent effects from previous exposure. Chronic fatigue, disorientation, and occasional memory loss were common. Auditory impairments persisted, as did subtle distortions of perception in space and time. Some researchers reported seeing transient forms in peripheral vision or feeling sudden pressure changes in empty rooms. Though these experiences were never officially verified, they were noted in confidential appendices. Security personnel occasionally recorded similar phenomena, often dismissing them as tricks of the mind caused by isolation and stress. The cumulative pattern, however, suggested a residual influence emanating from the artifacts and the locations where they had been studied. By the end of the decade, the human footprint at the facility had almost entirely vanished. A skeleton crew remained briefly to catalog and seal records. Reports were packed in reinforced crates, labeled with full dates and numerical codes. Photographic negatives, schematics, and handwritten logs were stored in climate-controlled chambers before being removed from the site entirely. When the last personnel left, the tunnels were left largely empty, silent except for the natural settling of concrete and occasional water seepage. The airfield above continued to function without incident, a thin veneer of normalcy concealing the underground remnants of the secret investigations. What remained were concrete corridors, steel-reinforced chambers, and stacks of sealed reports with dry dates and precise measurements. Between the lines of these documents, a hidden narrative persisted, a record of contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence during wartime and the long-term destructive impact on those who had attempted to study it. Though officially the facility was described as decommissioned and cleared of sensitive materials, the tunnels themselves retained a quiet, almost imperceptible resonance. Any subtle fluctuations in temperature, sound, or electromagnetic readings were attributed in later reports to natural phenomena. But the few who had served there knew that the true story of Object X, of its presence and disappearance, was embedded in the very structure of the underground labyrinth, echoing a war that had officially ended, yet left an enduring, intangible legacy on the people and the place they had inhabited. By the winter of 1950, the airfield had returned to routine military operations, but the underground network stood as a silent testament. Only the reports, the records, and the occasional faded photograph testified to what had transpired. The names of personnel were reduced to three-letter identifiers. The instruments had been removed and the artifacts transported elsewhere. The world above carried on unaware, while beneath the earth, concrete tunnels and sealed records preserved the evidence of contact, the remnants of influence, and the quiet disappearance of those who had dared to engage with something beyond human comprehension.